Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Skidmore from the North. I'm serving I'm serving as the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and so welcome to our webinar. Today we have Charles Marone, also known as Chuck. He is a professional engineer as well as has a degree in engineering and has also a master's degree in urban and regional planning, both from University of Minnesota. He is the director of Strong Towns, and I got to know a little bit about Strong Towns' work and Chuck's work through an interview that he was giving with former Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Catherine Austin Fitts. And during that interview, Chuck talked about a city in Louisiana in which the value of the infrastructure underneath the ground, the water, the sewer, the roads, was for every $1 of private investment above the ground, there was $2 below. And he was just talking about the degree to which that is sustainable. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to invite him to our webinar and talk a little bit about the work that he does. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Chuck. And Chuck, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really happy to be here and to present stuff. And actually, I'm going to start out with Lafayette. So good introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here and for listening. Just real briefly, Strong Towns is a 501c3. We have a mission to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. Our last slide will give you our website address so you can tie into our conversation and get more information. I was very fortunate to be invited to go to Lafayette, Louisiana as part of a team that was working with the city on their financial situation. They have, like most cities in North America, a huge backlog of infrastructure maintenance, a huge backlog of things that they want to do, investments that they want to make, and really no reasonable expectation that they're ever going to have the money to do any of these things. So we went and we spent weeks there. We went back multiple times, interviewed all the staff, pulled data, put things together. I'm going to give you a little overview, and then towards the end, we're going to get to some of the bigger picture things. But we came across this great map of their water system, and it really tells the story of what has happened, not just to Lafayette, but to cities all over North America following World War II. In 1949, Lafayette had a population of 33,500. Up to up to 2015, that had grown by 3.5 times to 121,000. During that same period of time, the amount of pipe in the ground per person grew from 5 feet to 50 feet. So a 10x, 10 times. If we look at hydrants, there's a great map that we had of their water system in 1949. What we found is that there were 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people back then. Today, we have 51.3, a 21 times increase. So we've increased our population by 3.5 times. We've increased our amount of pipe by 10x. We've increased our hydrants by 21x. What have we done to our wealth? If we look at median household income back in the 1950s, adjusted for inflation, so this is in today's dollars, 27,700. Today, we're up 1.6 to 45,000. What we see, and we see this clearly over and over and over again, is that it takes a lot more input. It takes a lot more spending, a lot more infrastructure to get 1 ounce of wealth, 1 ounce of prosperity, 1 ounce of growth and job creation compared to what it used to, right? If you are a family of 4 back in 1950, the excess wealth of your family was expected to maintain about 20 feet of pipe. Today, it's expected to maintain about 200 feet of pipe. And that's like the fundamental imbalance. One of the things that we did early on at Strong Towns is we started to look at our development pattern, look at things that had been built, and tried to get an understanding of why our cities were struggling so much financially. This is a simple dead-end street. It's a dead end cul-de-sac with some residential homes. This was built in the mid 1990s. The city paid half when it was built, and the property owners paid the other half. We asked the question, just based on the revenue the city collects from the people who live in this development, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the half they spent to build this road? The answer is 37 years. Now, that's longer than the road is going to last, but it's going to take the city that long just to break even. Here's another residential development. This one, the same kind of thing. It's a closed loop system. There's a dead end up on the top. These are just residential homes, no commercial traffic, no through traffic. This was built in the early 1980s. When it was built, the developer paid all the costs. Those costs were rolled over, of course, into the sale price of the homes. People have been counting this on their property values for years, while they've also been paying taxes to the city with the idea that the city would then go out and fix and maintain this when it ultimately needed that work to be done. The city did go out and fix the road. The road had fallen apart. The cost was $354,000. We asked the question, based on the taxes that the city collects from the people in this development, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the amount of money they just spent to fix that road? The answer is 79 years. We then said, okay, what if the city wanted to try to recoup enough money from these property owners, the only property owners that really use the road in any meaningful way? What if they wanted to try to recoup the money that it would take to fix the road again between now and the time the road fell apart? What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the water, all the underground stuff is way, way more expensive. There's a business park. A lot of times people, say we don't really care what happens with residential. We're really worried about commercial. If we can just get enough commercial property and jobs and commercial growth, we'll be fine. This is a business park that was built in the mid 1990s. It's completely built out. The city wants to build the exact same thing on property they own right next door. They said, this has been so successful, let's go build the same thing. So we asked the question, if we could build the same thing for the same amount of money and get the same amount of investment, would this be a good project? Today's dollars, if you bring them up to the current, it would be 2.1 million. If we step back and look, there's 6.6 million of improvements in the park. For our scenario, we looked at the existing park and noted that 4 of the lots are a church, 2 of the lots belong to the school district, 1 of the lots is a city maintenance garage, and 1 of the lots is a county maintenance garage. None of these pay any taxes to the city. So we had to, in order to make the math work in our new development, actually assume that every single entity was not only a full taxpayer, but was going to be non-subsidized. Everybody in the current park that actually paid taxes, in theory, got a long-term tax subsidy. We had to assume those 2 things. We had to also assume that every lot was going to be built on within, within 1 year of the park being built, and that every penny of new revenue would go to retiring that bond that the city took on. If that were the case, it would still take almost 30 years, almost 3 decades, 29 years for the city to break even. That's 29 years where everybody's taxes would need to go up to pay to plow the streets, to mow the ditches, to provide police and fire protection, and every other service that was needed. And that's in a wildly optimistic scenario. Let me talk about what's happening here, because we've gone on and done dozens and dozens of these examples. And it's actually, if you want some, I'll give you the address at the end of our website. You can see them there. But it's actually pretty easy to understand what's going on once you recognize it. When cities experience new growth, whether that is new growth from a developer coming in and making an investment, whether it's new growth from a grant they get, money they borrow, whatever the catalyst is that creates the new growth in our current model, what we see is that the cash flow situation for the local government is very, very good. Someone else has paid the initial costs. The initial costs are not borne directly as part of the development project by the local government. They're borne by someone else. But what the local government does is it promises that someday, when this road needs to be fixed, when this pipe needs to be repaired, when the sidewalk needs to be, renovated, we'll go out there and do that. We'll be responsible for that. So what we see is that, and I've done a cash flow for just one development here. What we see is that in the early years, there's just money coming in, right? There's no money going out. This has been paid for by a developer. It's been paid for by a grant. It's been paid for by some type of loan that you've got somewhere. From a cash flow standpoint, the money coming in from new taxes, from this new growth, is all positive. It looks really good. It's very rosy. A 5-year-old street doesn't cost you anything. A 10-year-old sidewalk doesn't cost you anything. A 15-year-old pipe isn't costing you anything. And so for a couple of decades, you've just got a very positive cash flow, all this money coming in and nothing going out. The problem is eventually the stuff falls apart and you have to go out and fix it. And what we find is that project by project by project, when we look at this, the cumulative amount of money that we bring in over the life of this infrastructure is insufficient to actually pay for its maintenance. And from a cash flow standpoint, we ultimately run far into the negative. Now, what cities do, of course, because the positive feedback you get from growth is so great, that the way we respond to difficulty is to try to grow some more. This is that same project I showed you in the last slide, modeled as if it were to occur every other year. So a nice, steady, continuous growth rate, which is, the ideal scenario for any city. We have all this new growth coming in, developers coming in and doing developments. We're able to give out some tax subsidies or get some grants or what have you. We don't have the upfront cost to put in this road, this street, this sidewalk, this pipe. Someone else pays for that. But what we do is we as a local government say, when it falls apart, we will take care of it. If you look at this scenario, what you see is that, not only do we have growth in year 1, a new development in year 3, a new development in year 5, not only do we have all this growth, we have no expenses, right? Everything is brand new. We don't have to go out and fix that road yet. We don't have to repair that pipe yet. And so as you go in time, because we're having this growth going on, we feel very, very rich. We feel very wealthy. The growth gives us what we call the illusion of wealth. When we get to year 25 in this example, sure, we got to spend a little bit of money on that very first development back in year 1, but it's not a big deal, right? We've had all this growth. Sadly, we all intuitively understand when you lose money over time on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. And when you run this out long term, as we go out in time, what we see is that even when cities continue to grow at a nice steady pace, the accumulation of liabilities just creates this huge downward pressure on your budget. We are now, 70 years past this explosion of growth we had after World War II, this very new, different way of building cities. And what we find is that our cities everywhere are, even the ones that are growing their liabilities far more quickly than they're growing their assets. We are exchanging near-term benefits in cash for long-term promises and obligations. And the two don't balance out. We are creating for ourselves and have created for ourselves these enormous long-term liabilities that we really have no possibility to pay for. And we today live in that world. We live in the future of the people who built this stuff in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We live in their future, and we're tasked with maintaining it. And we just don't have the wealth around to do that. When we look at the way cities were built really throughout all of human history, with a demarcation point being the Great Depression, what came after the Great Depression is a very different style, a very different approach to growth and building cities and building places than before. What we see is that the primary differentiation point is that we used to build cities incrementally over time. Now we build developments all at once, and we build them to a finished state. When you build things incrementally over time, what it allows you to do is take small little bets to see what works, to see what pays off, and to build incrementally on the things that are successful. We see this modeled in natural systems all over the world. We see this modeled in everything from, how Google and Amazon algorithms work to the way that rainforests construct themselves. These human habitats built slowly and incrementally over time wind up to be very strong, very resilient, and very financially productive. This is my hometown back in 1870. I live in Brainerd, Minnesota, a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is what it looked like in its first iteration. You can imagine some lumberjacks, getting off the train, planing out some wood and just popping up these buildings. Nobody knew if this was going to work. In fact, there's another little settlement just a few miles from here that started out just like this. It didn't work. The people there salvaged what they could. They moved over to the next spot. This one did take, and so what we see is that 30 years later, those little pop-up shacks would become these kind of buildings, these buildings of brick, would become these wood structures. Give it, excuse me, I got a little cough here. Give it another 40 years, and these 2 and 3 story wood structures would grow into buildings of brick and granite. What we see is that traditional development patterns never went to the casino and put all their money on red. They never tried some big mega project that would trickle down and create growth and wealth for people. It was always a modest investment over a broad area over a long period of time. This kind of approach pays huge financial dividends in ways that are kind of shocking to us today. These are two identical blocks here in my hometown. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. The city is actually labeled in the past both of these as blight. If you look at them, you'll see they're the same size, the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. Everything about them is the same except for the style of development. That old blighted rundown block looks like this. As my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out in the 1920s were these 3 blocks. What you're looking at is the pop-up shack equivalent of what you would have been able to build in the 1920s out on the far edge of town. Had things proceeded here as they had for thousands of years, we would have expected to see second stories, third stories. The buildings would become more intense, more ornate. Of course, that's not what happened. After these were built, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and then we had this completely new style of development that just skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These blocks have stagnated for 90 years. The city went in, labeled these areas blight, got the block 2 over from the first one torn down, and now we have the new drive-through taco place. This meets all the zoning codes, all the engineering requirements. It provides plenty of parking. It's got sidewalks. It's got some native plants in the stormwater area. It basically meets every checklist we have, not only for our local zoning code, but for the way we finance this stuff nationally, for the banks, for the insurance companies, for everybody. The stuff on the right, the building on the right, is the ideal scenario for what we're trying to accomplish today, while the building on the left is something that is antiquated blight of a time past, difficult to finance. It doesn't meet our codes. You couldn't build this today if you wanted to. Yet when we step back and we look, what we see is that block on the left, the old and blighted block. When you add up the value of all the properties there, it's $1.1 million. When you go 2 blocks over to the shiny and new, even though it's the same size area, it's the same amount of public infrastructure, it's the same cost to the community. What we see is that this style of development is much less valuable, only $800,000 when it was built, when it was brand new. Understand what you're looking at. On the left, you're looking at the traditional pattern of development, the way we build cities for thousands of years around the world, incrementally over time. And you contrast that to the right, which is our new style of development, where we build all at once to a finished state. There's no next iteration. There's no improvement on this. This is it. This is the building we have now on this site. And it is being outperformed by this old rundown stuff. In its kind of infant form, after 90 years of neglect, it outperforms it by a wide margin. And we all actually understand what happens over time to this modern style of development, right? Here's what the property values are now 4 years later. We see that not only is it outperforming the gap is widening. It's now a 78% gap as opposed to 42 when we first got started. This is the same kind of thing we see out on the edge of our cities. This is our 20-acre big box complex. This is the most valuable piece of property in the entire area. Got a double-sized big box store, auto dealership, gas station. When these people show up at a meeting, we just stop the meeting, right, and ask them, like, what do you guys need? This is our 20 acres in our core downtown. You'll notice a lot of the buildings have been ripped down or burned down and are now parking lots. We kind of struggle to keep tenants in the second and third stories. The first stories struggle as well. We're making strides. We're trying to make it a little bit better, but no one would say this is a great place. It's run down and it needs a couple decades of TLC. When we look out on the edge of town, the best of the best out there has a total value of $0.6 million an acre. It's a huge sum of money. Yet when we look at the same size area, 20 acres in our core downtown, just a different approach to development, what we see is a total amount of wealth that's 78% greater. The city's actually collecting 78% more taxes from that 20 acres of run-down, dilapidated, neglected buildings in the downtown than they are at the best of the best on the edge. And we spent hundreds of millions to get that stuff on the edge. I mean, we spent a couple $100 million on the bypass. We spent 30 plus million running sewer and water out to the area. We spent millions on frontage roads and backage roads. Those are investments that will go on and on, that we are obligated to go out and fix and repair now when they go bad, despite the lack of tax base, despite the lack of productivity. When we look at that stuff out on the edge, we understand that is the peak, right? Whatever comes next when that building goes out of business or changes use, whether it's 5 months from now, 5 years from now, or 50 years from now, that is the peak. We've seen this enough around the country that we know what comes next is not going to be as valuable as this. And so you're looking at the peak scenario right now. When you look at that 20 acres on the right, what we know and understand is that these buildings are highly adaptable. There are 134 different properties there. When one of them loses a tenant, someone goes out of business, someone retires, the market shifts, the market changes. These buildings can become many different things over time. They're highly adaptable. They're highly flexible. There's a reason why our ancestors, and I say that in the largest possible sense of the word, there's a reason why our ancestors built this way. It's very adaptable. It's very flexible. It is strong, and it is financially really, really productive. I'm going to show you a snapshot of some cities from around the country just to give you kind of a bigger view of the case I'm making. I've shown you a couple specific sites. Now I'm going to show you citywide. If you think of a farmer going out and planting seed in a field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive parts of the field. That's where you get the most, bushels per acre or whatever it happens to be. I'm going to show you right now financial productivity. Where in a city do we get the most value per acre? This is Buffalo, New York. I happen to really like Buffalo, New York, but Buffalo, New York is a city that has gone through some distress, to say the least. Since World War II, they have lost population every single year. If you're willing to move to Buffalo today, they will sell you a house for $1 if you will promise to live there for 5 years and make some improvements. So this is a place with a certain level of desperation. Yet if you look at Buffalo, New York, and you say, where's the wealth? Where is the value? Can you point to where the traditional downtown is? And not only is it this massive repository of wealth, it actually dwarfs everything around it. It is a huge financial gain from that old traditional incremental development pattern. We see this in cities of every size. Here's a city of about 50,000. See the same kind of pattern. Here's a little city of 1,200. When I first went to this city, they brought me to the edge of town on the south there, on the east there. They said, Chuck, we've got some really great stuff going on, but these core neighborhoods are terrible. The houses are terrible. We got to get this stuff torn down and get it replaced with something that is decent. And then we showed them where all their wealth is in all those bad neighborhoods. in all the neighborhoods where the poor people live. So back to Lafayette, Louisiana. When we went to Lafayette, we sat and mapped out and studied every source of revenue that the city had, all the tax revenue, the utility fees, all the stuff that they were bringing in. And we mapped those out. We had dozens of maps. We then looked at every expense that the city had, not only to maintain roads and streets and pipes and infrastructure, but to provide bus service and provide police service and fire protection and all the different things. We did to the best of our ability. We went and mapped these out and basically showed here's the cost and here's the revenue for every parcel within the city of Lafayette, Louisiana. When we're done with this, we took every map and we mashed them together. And so what you're looking at right here is a profit and loss statement for the city of Lafayette. This is in green are the properties that are producing more revenue than they cost to actually service and maintain. And everywhere you see red, you have the opposite. You have a piece of property that costs more to provide service to than actually contributes taxes to the public. The green areas are, in a sense, profitable for this corporation known as a city that we are all taxpayers in. We are all shareholders in. If you own property or you live in the city of Lafayette, you are a shareholder in this corporation known as the city. The green areas are the ones that are profitable for you. The red areas are not. What are these areas? I believe I do have a pointer here, so let me use that. Oh, I do. Sweet. So let me show you. You have this big green spike right here. That big green spike is a new urbanist development. By new urbanism, I mean it uses traditional development styles with modern finance. So everything is built with narrow streets, tight lots, front porches, pulled up to the street. So very low cost in terms of infrastructure comparatively, but everything is built with modern finance. So all at once to a finished state. There's no next generation of this. There's no next succession of this. What is there is anticipated to be there in that way forever. The problem with this, of course, is that 25 years after everything is built, everybody's driveway is going to fail at the same time. Everybody's roof in this entire development will go bad at the same time. Everybody's appliances are going to fail within a few years of each other. And so the development, and we see this in development styles in this modern approach with modern finance, this is the characteristic we see. They will enjoy a period of time of great prosperity. Then as things start to go bad and there isn't a renewal mechanism, there's no way to take a property in decline and invest in it and get something more out of it. It just is what it is. You're not allowed to do anything more with it. What we see is that properties eventually stagnate and they go through a period of stagnation and then there's a rapid fall off and decline. Right now, this development is doing great. How will that hold up in the future? It's very unclear. This area in here, this is their core downtown. If you've never been to Lafayette, Louisiana, I will just testify here that their downtown is not all that great. They try hard. They're working to make it better, but it needs a lot of love. They struggle in many, many ways. I don't think that there is anybody who is invited to visit Lafayette that is then taken by their host downtown to be shown the great downtown. It's not what it's happening there. But financially, doing fantastic, despite the decline. There's a crescent of green that runs through here. You kind of see it running through here. I call this a crescent of green. What is that? Those are the poor neighborhoods. Those are the neighborhoods where all the poor people live. When we went there and we're going to get an Airbnb, those are the places where the staff said, don't go there. Don't get a room there. That's where the homicides happen, where the burglaries happen. Just stay out of that neighborhood. Everything else on this map is red. All this stuff out here is red. All this stuff out here is red. Everything out here is red. What is that? Those are the strip malls, the big box stores, the corporate chain restaurants, the windy streets with the cul-de-sacs, the big houses with the three-car garages, that kind of thing. As was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Lafayette has a situation where for every dollar of private investment, there's $2 of public investment. The wealth of the private sector in Lafayette has to somehow, in order to maintain everything that's out there, in the course of a lifetime, needs to generate double the amount of taxable, income of taxes just to pay to maintain the stuff they have. It's an insane amount. It will not happen. It can never happen. Lafayette is struggling with the two subsidies that we see everywhere across the country. Subsidy number one, future, the poor neighborhoods are subsidizing the affluent neighborhoods. This is something we see everywhere we look, every place we've ever modeled. Subsidy number two, future generations subsidize the present generation. In Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. They will pay other taxes to the state and the county, or the parish, I'm sorry, and the school district, but to the city, it's $1,500 a year. In order to make good on every promise shown on this map, taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200. One out of every $5 a median family makes would need to get sent to the city just to maintain the stuff they've already built. That will never, ever happen. And so Lafayette is going to be faced with the choices that we already see a lot of cities struggle with. Cities like Detroit, cities like Memphis, cities like Cleveland, where they are actually having to decide what neighborhoods do we keep, what neighborhoods do we let go, what street do we repair, what street do we allow just go back to dirt, what pipe do we fix, what pipe do we just say goodbye to. These are really difficult problems, and we're not prepared wholly to talk about them. When we do start to talk about them, though, what we can see is that we have a lot of opportunities available to us if we just think differently. These are from North Carolina, but they really could be anywhere. The numbers are pretty universal. Here's a Kmart at $384,000 an acre. Here's a Walmart at $967,000 an acre. When we go to the core downtown, here's an old warehouse that's been converted into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all time, Jimmy's Pizza House, $3.4 million an acre. Now take a look at that Jimmy's Pizza House. There's nothing flashy about that. There's nothing, complicated about that. That is something that every city in this country, no matter how poor, can go out and start building today. And if you realize like how much wealth that actually creates, that first iteration of the incremental development pattern, if you get out of your car and actually start experiencing your city instead of at 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, experience at 2 miles an hour, what you realize very quickly is that our cities are nothing but gaps. There's huge amounts of gaps everywhere. As an engineer, I look at a gap as just an expense, right? Here's a bunch of road with nothing on it. Here's a bunch of pipe with nothing on it. We're not that rich that we can do that. We're not that rich that we can just have that stuff all over the place. When we can humble ourselves to see the power of a place like Jimmy's Pizza to actually at very low cost build a huge amount of wealth, what we can do is we can start to see our way to this incremental development pattern again, where you start small, you start with nothing, and you incrementally build your way up to real wealth over time. I'm going to end with this story because I think it's a powerful one that gets our minds thinking differently. This comes from Memphis, Tennessee, where there's this old street called Broad Avenue, and the city basically walked away from Broad Avenue. They ripped out the streetcar stop. They ripped out the streetcar line. They put a highway through the middle of the neighborhood. Without the street traffic, without the streetcar, things just died. Some residents were fed up with the decline and the neglect. They took matters into their own hands. They went and worked with the property owners to get the buildings swept out. They swept up the sidewalks. They painted their own bike lanes. They painted their own crosswalks. They put out their own planters and benches. For one weekend, they invited businesses from around the community to come in kind of a street party kind of way and just show people, here's what we can do if we put our minds to it. Here's the kind of thing that can happen if we actually inhabit this space in a positive way. They didn't ask for permission from the city. They didn't go get Department of Health inspections. They just went out and did this. And when they were done, it wasn't the greatest place in the city, but it was a heck of a lot better than it was when they started. The city has since gone out and documented in this because of this project. 18 new businesses, 32 new jobs, $12 million of property value appreciation. The total public investment here is zero. Zero. When we actually start looking at our cities, not as places to drive through, but as places that are designed to create wealth, to build wealth for a community, to build wealth for families, to build wealth for small businesses. That wealth is actually what sustains the place. It's actually what helps you go out and fix the pipe, go out and fix the road. When we actually take a framing and start to understand that our communities today are financially spread out, they're really fragile, they have enormous expenses and very little wealth comparatively to actually meet all those obligations. What we realize is that we have to get back to first principles. We have to actually start doing the meat and potatoes. This is the basic kind of stuff that makes cities prosperous. When we can get out of our car and walk around our neighborhoods, what we find is that they're just dripping with opportunities. Opportunities for those early investments, those small little things that we can do that make a huge difference. Whether it's building at the scale of a Jimmy's Pizza or whether it's doing something like this little path here. I went to my city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. His response to me was, why would you say that, Chuck? We have to change the way we deliver local government. It's not good enough to do a public hearing. It's not good enough to sit behind a desk and put together a capital improvements plan. It's not good enough to do a visioning session and invite people to come and state their preferences for one approach or the other. We have to actually go out and observe in our neighborhoods where people struggle on a day-to-day basis, where people are struggling just to do basic things, and then ask ourselves a simple question. What is the next smallest thing that we can do right now to nudge this in a positive direction? And if we do that every day, day after day, week after week, year after year, if we can go out and humble ourselves to observe those things and ask that question, not only will we be making the lowest risk, highest returning possible investments that we can make, we can't help but improve people's lives in the process. That's what this is all about. How do we make our cities stronger and at the same time help people be better off? Thanks everybody for listening. I tried to go through that really quick so we had plenty of time for questions. If you are interested in more of this specific presentation, if you go to strongtowns.org, there's a drop-down menu for topics, and if you click on Curbside Chat, you will get a longer and more thorough rendition of this. There's also a ton of other stuff on that site. If you want to dig deeper, we publish 3 articles a day. We do a podcast a couple days a week. We're always putting out videos and other graphics and things to help share this message. If you're interested, go check us out there. I am happy to and was asked to leave plenty of time for questions. So I believe I used about a half hour there, and I believe we have 20 minutes or so left. I know you're asked to type your questions into the chat room. I've been watching that as we go, and I caught a couple in there. If you would like, Mark, I'm not sure if you wanted to read them or point them out or how you wanted to do this, but I'm happy to take whatever questions people have.
As we wait for people to type in questions, I just want to say thanks so much for your presentation. And in the beginning, you were talking about sort of borrowing from the future and sort of leaning on growth so much, and it made me think about public and city pensions, where it's easy to make pensions as long as you're growing, but when you're shrinking, it's a different story. Or Social Security, for that matter, as long as we have more people coming into the system, it's easy to make those payouts, but of course we all know that we have the same challenge that you described in cities with Social Security. And we think about Saginaw, Michigan, which has made some tough decisions to let roads go back to dirt, or Detroit, tearing down houses that are dilapidated, and I've done some work on that, and some real challenges. So it looks like we have a couple of questions coming in, and we can read those. But also, I just wonder what you think. Here we are where we may not be able to lean on growth in many places. So
Right.
how do we make some of those tough decisions and some of
I,
those changes?
I think it's important, and I think the pensions are a good way to think about this, because in the era we live in, uh, where things are not local anymore, the way they used to be in terms of our politics, they're very much national. Everything has been nationalized. I think it's easy to look at the pension problem in a right-left paradigm, right? Either government is inefficient and bloated and out of control, or people are cheap and not willing to pay their share and are willing to turn their back on people. And I find those narratives to be very unhelpful for understanding what actually happened. What actually happened was we got to a point where this suburban experiment, this way of building, this way of growing our cities was actually starting to break down. It didn't work. We had more liabilities than we had wealth to meet them. And so what cities did, and they did this largely in the mid 70s, early 80s, large scale across this country, cities went to their public employees and they made a deal with them. They said, hey, if you will accept lower wages today so that we can invest that money in new roads and new growth and other things, we're all going to be richer in the future and we will be able to pay you a higher pension. Um, that turned out to be a very bad deal for everyone because it was based on a flawed premise that if we just did more of what is bankrupting us, that somehow it would turn around and we'd get a different result. And so now we find ourselves in a place where we've had, decades more of this really unproductive development pattern that we can't afford. But we also have these promises we made, essentially IOUs that people are now cashing in on. I think we have to have a timeout. I think we have to acknowledge that we are not going to grow our way out of this using any type of method that got us here, right? Like we actually have to abandon some of those beliefs we have about our ability to grow ourselves out of this, and actually take stock of where we're at. And I think if we do that, it's like the first step in a 12-step program, right? Like admit you have a problem. I actually think that that's where we're at today. And before we can do much more, we've got to be able to do that as a culture, as a society.
Well, thanks. I see we have a couple of questions. One from Jan Flora. How does this approach relate to job creation? And Stuart is thinking about scale, bringing it down to the scale of a town or village. I wonder if you can comment on either of those questions.
Yeah, I love them both. Let's talk about job creation first. A lot of what we do from a public policy standpoint, we couch in terms of jobs. I was just listening to something this morning about the Clinton administration, and that was the first election that I was old enough to vote in. And I remember, the mantra there, it's the economy, stupid, jobs, jobs, jobs. It was all about, getting people working. And we do a lot of like ridiculous things under this mantra. And I get it. Socially, when people don't have productive labor, when they don't have productive jobs, it creates lots of problems. Problems that just trickle through the entire system. So I get our obsession with it. From a strong town standpoint, I want to flip it around, however. Right now, what we do is we focus on creating jobs as a way to create healthy, stable places. I think we have to look at this the other way. I think that healthy, stable places, jobs emerge from. When we have healthy, stable, productive places, we see jobs emerge from that situation. When people have stability, when they're not forced to, in a recessionary economy or when things are cut back, they're not forced to spend huge amounts of their income just getting places. In most places in the country, you have to have a car. If you have a family, you have to have two cars. You have a certain ante that you have to pay just to participate in society. We have created a very high burn situation where you have to keep the rates of growth going. And if for some reason you fall out of that, You become unemployed for a short period of time. You something happens and you can't make your mortgage payment or your car payment. You things go bad for you very, very quickly. So I think we have to get back to a situation where we're focusing on the stability of our cities, the resiliency of our neighborhoods, the resiliency of our places, and from that, good jobs will emerge. That's the way that history has always treated jobs. Let me focus on the question about how does this scale to towns and villages. It's funny because I'm usually asked the opposite question. Chuck, I see how this works in a small town like the one you live in. My city is about 13,000. Most of my professional work was in cities of 5,000 and under. So a lot of times people will say, well, how does this scale to a larger city, Chuck? And my answer to them is always larger cities. You can go to Manhattan prior to the Great Depression, and New York City was a collection of smaller villages, all kind of linked together. When we look at small towns, when we look at small villages, what we see today is that they've largely adopted this high burn growth rate kind of philosophy. They've essentially tried to become mini urban suburban areas. If you go to a metropolitan center, you'll see a core metro area with the skyscrapers. Then you'll have surrounded by stuff of different densities all the way out to the suburbs and the exurbs. And what we have done in small towns is we've taken that model, that vision of things, and we've exported it to the countryside. So my little town has the big part of the city in the middle, and then you go 2 blocks and it's the edge, and then you go half a mile more and you're in the suburbs, and then you go half a mile more and you're in the exurbs. And so we treat them like little urban ecosystems, when in fact small towns are very different entities. They are a lot more fragile than those large systems. There's much less room for error. And you can think of this just on an individual level. If you are, I'll take myself. If I'm an engineer, I move here right out of college. I moved back to my hometown. I got a job at the one engineering firm. If something hadn't worked out there, if I hadn't been the right employee for them, what would I have done? Where would I have gone? Where would I have worked? Maybe I could have gone on with the state if they had an opening. They have a lot of openings here. Those jobs tend to be lifelong jobs and people don't move around much. If I had gone to the metro area, if I had gone to Minneapolis, St. Paul instead, and it hadn't worked out at the first engineering firm I'd gone to, well, there were dozens of other ones. I could have, shifted, found a better place for me, found a better career path. Small towns tend to be like that. They tend to be places where there are fewer essential fallback positions. And what this has done is it's actually made us take bigger risks, when at the end of the day, it should actually do the opposite, make us a little bit more conservative in the collective risks that we take. We should be more leery about running that pipe a mile out of town to hook someone up, or ripping down a bunch of buildings to have a parking lot 2 blocks from where people could easily walk from. For some reason, we have a really hard time at the small town level thinking in that way, and I think that desperately needs to shift.
Chuck, I think John has a really interesting question. He's wondering how this information has been received by the private sector and suburban exurban development community.
That's a great question. It's interesting because there are a lot of developers out there trying to change and trying to do things differently, because there's a huge underserved market, and there's a real lucrative niche for people who grasp the incremental development approach. But what we see is that if we want to look at the I'm trying to say this without sounding like conspiratorial, because it's really not a conspiracy. It's just everybody kind of working in their own interests. If you look at the kind of alignment of interests between the big tract developers, Wall Street investment, and I would include the Federal Reserve in that, and also the federal government's policies to try to encourage home ownership. What we see is that there's a very lucrative game to be played, building more and more and more of this stuff across the landscape. Those people, when I've met with them, and I have met with them, they tend to look at our stuff and say, "Yeah, I see that." But this is this basically what we're doing. There's a market for, and as long as there's a market for it, people will continue to build it, including us. And my kind of macro response to that is, what creates the market? I mean, all the incentives we have, all the money we spend making this possible, whether it's on highways and infrastructure or on Fannie and Freddie and subsidizing mortgages and keeping interest rates low, or whether it's the home mortgage interest deduction. There's this endless kind of list of subsidies for this style of development. It's pretty hard to call that a market, but generally, these developers get what I'm saying, but they know they can sell this product. I think the harder one is the suburban exurban city, because a lot of times, and I'm gonna try to be as generous as I can here. A lot of times they look at the growth that they're having and the success that they're having as a byproduct of their own kind of brilliance and their own effort, as opposed to they're just like the next one in line, right? We chewed up this land back here. They're now in decline, so we move on to the next place. The next place, looks and says, well, we're infinitely better than the last place you were at. That's why we're growing, as opposed to, we're just the next one in line. They tend to struggle much more with this because, we're basically telling them you're not as special as you think you are. You're just the next one.
Well, we have a couple more questions here, and then maybe I have a question if there's enough time. Yusri Jamal has a question about Urban 3, and Brent is got another question about other types of capital: social, cultural, political, natural.
Let's look at. I can answer the Urban 3 one really quickly. The Lafayette work was a partnership between me and Urban 3. I was actually part of their team. A lot of the 3D maps I showed you came from Urban 3. Joe Minicozy, the founder of Urban 3, and I are best friends, and we chat all the time. And we're bosom buddies, and we work on all this together. And I would like to think that I help them out, and I can certainly tell you that they have informed my thinking on a lot of these topics. Have I been able to link our research to other forms of wealth that exist? I'm going to say not as a primary focus, no. And I'll say it for these reasons. I think there are a lot of really great organizations out there that deal with this. There's a lot of people out there working on social justice issues, political and cultural issues. There's a lot of people out there working on environmental issues. We find a lot of overlap with them, and we find a lot of common ground with them. There's a lot of places that we can work together and see things in the same way. We're really motivated by the financial health of our cities, and we think that a lot of things fall under that. There's a lot of things that touches on, but that's our obsession. And I think when you let me put this in like a nice way, or as friendly a way as I can, because I do admire a lot of these other organizations that I think are doing great work in this space. But when your obsession is something else, what tends to happen is that you tend to always compromise the financial part. You say, well, I realize this may not make financial sense, but my biggest value is the environment. So we may have to just bite the bullet on this one. Or you get to the end and you say, well, my biggest value is our parks, or this social justice issue that I'm working on. That's not to denigrate any of those things. We need people advocating for all of those things. But our core argument is that if you don't take care of the money, none of this other stuff's going to matter. If you don't obsess over how to have your place be solvent, and then find wins for all those other things within the context of being solvent, all those other things are not going to matter for very long. They're really not. Now that being said, there's a ton of overlap here, and I actually, Strong Towns approach to me is a social justice approach. It is about cultural cohesion. It is about localizing our politics and our conversations so that we actually talk to each other again and work out our problems. I think it's a very pro-environmental approach because it's about stopping just the like frenetic horizontal spread of our cities. Like I said, there's a lot of overlap there, but we don't tend to focus on it because we do have this singular overriding focus that really drives our conversation in a way that is unique and I think has separated our conversation from others.
Well, thanks, Chuck. We have just about 3 minutes left, and we don't have any other questions. So I want to ask you one last question. And I'm an economist by training, and I've worked in urban areas, and I took on the role of director of a rural development center because I saw a lot of similar challenges and with structural changes in the economy that have led to population decline in rural places as well as some of our urban core areas. And now we're faced with having to make some really difficult decisions about what to reinvest in terms of infrastructure. If you invest too much, you're putting pressure on on a limited tax base. And so, how do have you thought about, or Strong Towns thought about, how a community that is smaller than it used to be should prioritize with regard to infrastructure reinvestment? Because you do need some, but you may not
Yes.
need what you once had. And so just welcome your thoughts on
I actually, yes, have thought a ton about this. Here's to me how I would prioritize things. I think you have to start with the fact that human beings, people, not drivers, not workers, not consumers, but just people out on the street, people in the neighborhood. They're your indicator species for success. And so if you go out and you search for where are people and where are they gathered, that will give you like the number one prioritization of where you should be spending your money. Wherever you have people who are naturally gathering, that's a place where you can start to create some kinetic energy in a space and have that spread to other spaces. The second aspect of this then is that we've got to get back to the incremental mindset. And so when you're investing in places where people are, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get them connected to other places where people are. And the way you do that is by making small, modest investments. Um, you know, we have worked with cities to try to identify what those are. They're never the big highway project. They're never the big street reconditioning project. They're never the multi-million dollar, build something out to a field and see what you can create. They're always things like plant a row of trees here, fix this broken sidewalk, put in a crosswalk here, change this path where people are walking into a paved trail. Uh, you know, get a little starter house going in this spot over here where you have a gap. Uh, when we can start to think at that scale and at that level, we're making investments that are very small. We can do this on any budget in any city, anywhere in this country. We have the wealth to actually make this scale of investment. Because they're small investments, they're very low risk. If for some reason it doesn't work out, you're not down that much. It's okay. You can come back from that. You can make that work. But what we find again and again is if you start with where people are gathered and you look at where those people are struggling on a day-to-day basis and you try to address that with the next smallest step, the next smallest investment, what we find is that those investments more often than not are very successful. And they lead to better places. They lead to private sector investment. They lead to wealth creation. And they lead to people living better lives. I think we start small and we think small and we act in incremental ways. We can't help but, even if we're stumbling, we're not gonna help but stumble our way into success.
that. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for today. Thank you very much for taking time. the whole webinar will be recorded and it'll be out on YouTube, and we'll share that, and we get lots more folks through the YouTube connection as well. So we'll send that out to everyone as well, and you can share that. And I think, yeah, Chuck, go ahead.
No, I just gonna say wonderful. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate the chance to share this message with people.
Yeah, thank you again, and everybody have a good day.